Eric, it's happened.
What happened, Omar?
What didn't happen? 2022 is already shaping up to be the year. People got the Mayan calendar wrong when they said the end of the world would be 2012. It actually is the beginning of the new world, the ruling of Sir Helms and this guy right here, 2022, standing atop the pyramid. Because, folks, we got some major news. This man right here, Mr. Dr. Eric Helms, PhD, and that's the only way to properly refer to him, my boy, is on the second episode of Ancient Workouts with Omar, the new History Channel series. And it's not just because you're my boy, Eric, but you did crush it.
Well,
And, I mean, I recognize the bias, but just because I have the bias doesn't mean I'm wrong type of thing. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, maybe I say a lot of things about your physique, and that's just because I'm a fan. But it's not like they're not true. So it's just showing appreciation. Fair?
I'll take it. I'll
Good.
take what I can get, and I'm getting this, and I'll take it. So thank you. It was an honor to be on. I think you were in that episode too, right?
Only a little bit. Now, here's the thing. I want everyone's listening right now to listen to the first several minutes. I want to make Eric a regular fixture. They are reading the comments, and I do mean this sincerely, Eric. I think you're atop the pyramid. You're at the tippity top for science, fitness communicators. So your ability to make it succinct, practical, something that they could really take away. So sometimes complex subjects in a way that the layperson can't understand it. I think no one does it better, and I mean that sincerely. And that's why, like, that's Iron Culture. That's why you're the dude. You crushed it on the episode in a limited time, and you were there. Like you said, we had to do a few takes. You talked about protein for the Viking episode, but I want everyone, we're going to link it in the description, both for the, even if you're on iTunes, just listening to audio, or on YouTube, I want you to give a compliment about Eric, and I'm being dead serious. Something about like, man, wow, this individual really has the ability to distill this information into an understandable format, or like whatever you want. You could call him hunky, like I call him hunky all the time. Whatever you want, but just forget me, fuck this guy right here, talk about Eric and boost him up in the episode. Seriously, I want to see 100 comments from the cult, because they take a qualitative look at it. Oh, like, what are the comments like? Oh, this guy, Eric? Oh, okay. Like, he's a good guy. Oh, we should bring him back. Because, Eric, correct me real quick. I forget. I had you on for protein for the Viking episode. Did we film 2 or 3 segments with you? I know there was at least 2 topics, maybe a third.
I am also not sure if it was 2 or 3, but I do remember talking about, spoiler alert, Milo of Croton and Progressive Overload as well.
Yeah.
At the very least. And those are the 2 I remember, talking about protein and then Progressive Overload. So I think 2 segments?
Yeah. No, you did. So we have the mass lads on. So there's also Mike Zordos, there's Eric Trexler. But they're not my children. I could play favorites. There's a reason why Eric Trexler's my second favorite Eric. He's one of my favorite people, but he's my second favorite Eric, if that makes sense. Is that I want Eric to be a fixture in this thing, and there are plans, designs, concepts for what a season 2 could look like, or even perhaps a bigger production. So I would love to roll up, wrap in, bring along my boy Eric for as much as possible, because I really do think if we're talking about making science understandable for the masses and having the most correct, up-to-date information, so at least it's out there and they could absorb it if they want and make it in a fun, interesting way. Even, once again, your diction, intonation, everything about the way you communicate is in such a format that I think people find it pleasant. Like, it's not like, oh, boy, like, oh, okay, I'm going to talk about this. And the first thing you got is, I'm like, oh my God, everyone's tuning out. So 100 comments, at least from the cult. Whatever you want to say about Eric, you could say the physical attributes. I would focus on his ability to communicate, because that's relevant to History Channel, but whatever you want. Do it now.
Well, now that you spent all that time building me up,
yeah,
I got to tear myself down.
What an Eric thing to do. You're literally trying to find faults that aren't there, and that's just you, but go ahead. Go ahead.
These are objectively true, real faults, and even deserving of an apology and a correction. So we're going to step out of canon for a second.
Okay.
Canon being that we are infallible.
Right.
I would say gods, but we are certainly more than men.
Yeah.
In the canon iron culture, sitting atop the pyramid, cult-like leadership of uniting all lifters under one totalitarian rule.
Yeah.
Stepping outside of canon, just for a moment.
Yeah.
I do need to make 2 corrections, Omar. One is relatively minor, and one is a little more major, but I think actually quite interesting. So we'll start with the minor one. So for those who were listening just, I think 2 episodes back, Omar, on the time-restricted feeding update, is that accurate?
Yeah, about 2 episodes, yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be, there's 2 episodes between this one and that one at most, or maybe one. Not that long ago. I'm not going to look it up. Who has time for that? I'm just going to get it wrong and have to do another correction anyway. So, no, but I repeatedly said Moro 2019 when I was referring to the study that led into the year-long study. And unfortunately, there is no such thing as Moro 2019 if you're trying to look that up. The study that was 8 weeks long that led into the 12-month long study was actually Moro 2016. So I'm not sure if I was confusing it with the Tinsley et al. Study from 2019 on time-restricted feeding in women, or if I was just doing an upside-down dyslexia thing with the 6. But nonetheless, I got that wrong. My sincere apologies. If you are curious about reading the time-restricted feeding studies that I was specifically referencing in that episode, there are a few that I'd recommend checking out. First, there's a 12-month long. And that's Morrow et al. 12 months of time-restricted eating and resistance training improves inflammatory markers and cardiometabolic risk factors. And then there is the first 8 weeks of that study with a larger sample. It was then those could opt in who wanted to carry on for a full 12 months, so 10 months longer. And that was Morrow et al. 2016, effects of 8 weeks of time-restricted feeding, in parentheses 16.8 on basal metabolism, maximal strength, body composition, inflammation, and cardiovascular risk factors in resistance-trained males. Always a nice, succinct title that we have in science. And then the one by Tinsley et al. On women that was 2019 is Tinsley et al. 2019, time-restricted feeding plus resistance training in active females, a randomized trial. So those were the dates that I kind of swapped around accidentally. That's the more minor error, Omar. So if anyone was looking that up and couldn't figure out what the heck I was talking about, that will hopefully help. But if we go all the way back, it's not all the way back, but decently far back to our overtraining episode. Okay. Remember where we talked about the overlap between REDS and overtraining syndrome and what actually overtraining meant. I was talking about some of the studies that were used to actually induce not overtraining syndrome. If you recall correctly, we've never actually observed that in resistance training, but certainly non-functional overreaching, where we actually saw a decline in performance that was simply just not monitored long enough to ensure that it was actually overtraining, which would take months. And I actually doubt that performance was down for months following these protocols. I got the one by Margonis and colleagues correct, but I actually misrepresented Fry, and this will probably blow your mind, Omar. Do you remember how we were blown away by the fact that in Fry's study he had them come in, quote unquote, twice per week and work up to a 1RM and then repeat 10 singles at a 1RM?
100%, yes.
Yeah, that's terrible, right? That's not what they did. I think maybe just the sane person inside of me who wanted to believe that there weren't truly scary things in the universe like Cthulhu and this protocol just dyslexified it a bit. It wasn't this protocol twice per week. It was that they did this every day for 2 weeks.
No. We got it. No.
It's real.
How? So I'm joking when I say this, but how did people not die? Not actually die, but I mean just mentally want to quit. Because you're talking 10. What was it, Eric? They work up to a max, and then they take a percentage off, and then what happens? Like they have to keep doing it for how long?
So 10 by 1 at 100% of 1RM. Yeah. And granted, that number is surely going down each time they do another one after the first, like, say, 3 or 4. And they did that for 2 weeks. So
real quick, because I do want to comment on how crazy this is. This is so there's Cthulhu, and then there's Hereditary, right? There's Paimon, they're headless, ruling atop. He tries, but then we just kick him down with Draperism. Mm-hmm. But here's why it's really scary to me, Eric. There's a difference between us being assigned said workout. Hey guys, like Omar, Eric, like you're in Eric's basement, you're training in New Zealand, it's going glorious. Work up to a top single, 100%. And then you have to do 100% for 10 singles. So what? It'll go down, let's say 3% or 4, whatever, every single set. Yeah. Okay.
I would love to actually see the load progression or the change in load. Because I don't think it progressed, if it didn't go up.
I'm getting stronger. It's like, what's that movie?
Well, dude, actually the reason why, so this isn't just a protocol they pulled out of their butt, by the way. Oh, no. So if I was to tell you what they tried to do previously and what happened, it would probably blow your mind. But go ahead, you continue. Okay. I'll leave that as a plant the seed for insanity in a moment.
So it's like that film Unbreakable. I was going to say, Eric, that in these studies, they make sure there's a requisite level of effort. Like it's kind of a given where they say in a lot of these things. So either the coordinators, whoever, like yelling, encouraging you, this isn't like a 100% that's really at 8. You know what I mean? Like it's not like a 93%. So when we talk 100%, I could only imagine probably the effort for 10 sets of 1 every single day is crazy. Like that's crazy.
Yeah, the way they would actually do it is that probably a sizable minority of the participants in the study would have missed a load increase on a 1RM and then used the previous attempt as their 1RM, and then they would try to repeat it. And any time that they could not complete it, they would go down and load a little bit, say like 5 pounds, and try again. So there was actually a number of like getting pinned or needing to get a spot because they couldn't get out of the hole with the squat, intermixed with these 10 successful attempts. Now, obviously, I wasn't there, and methods aren't always super, super explicit as to how it was done, but there is enough to glean that that's probably the case, where the 1RM protocol that's typically used is you work up to a max, and if you overshoot, you go back to the previous one, or unless the participant and all the researchers are like, yeah, that was definitely a max. And these are, experienced resistance training researchers, right? And then if you look at the protocol, they adjust the load based if they couldn't complete a max at the same load by, I think, 4.5 kilos. So like a 10-pound reduction.
That's not a lot,
No, it's not. So here's the wild thing that I shout out to Tone Loke. We're going to do the wild thing here, is that the reason why they use this protocol, 2 weeks of doing it daily, is that in a previous study, they intended to induce overtraining. And they did 8 singles with 95%, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. Okay. And that actually, at the group level on average, increased 1RM in the participants.
Nice.
So it objectively was not overtraining. And this is the reason why the overtraining criteria of it requires you to have a reduction in performance is not a target, right? That's why like the concept of MRV is not where you're supposed to train. You're supposed to train where you get the maximal adaptation, not the most you can possibly do. I do think these people probably would have increased their 1RM more in those 3 weeks with a protocol that was less ridiculous. And I guarantee you, while they might have been happy their 1RM went up, they all felt terrible working and doing eight singles and 95% of 1RM for 3 weeks, 5 days a week. So I think it's just a really important. Well, first, it's just crazy to think that was done and they went, wasn't enough. Let's go to daily. And that's just like, for a short period of overreaching, you can really push yourself quite hard. This is why a lot of people, when they talk about the 1RM they hit during Smolov, for example, if you talk to them within a year of that, their 1RM was typically higher then than it is now. Yeah. As Dan John says, after every peak, there's a cliff. So it's not necessarily the best way to train, a smart way to train, or even a safe way to train when we talk about like the risk that you might incur with these huge spikes and valleys in total load that you're lifting in terms of, or like the total load put forth in training. I don't mean load like load on the bar, but the training load, big picture, quote unquote. And I think that's why the topic du jour, if you will, Omar, of deloads, something that we really haven't gone into too much depth on, would be a really good thing to talk about today.
Eric, so we're going to dive right into that. That is the perfect segue, talking about tapering, deloads, a whole bunch of different things. I'm going to recover our fumble right here where we, that was a good act. Good job just bringing those things up, pretending that we were wrong. I think it was believable. We have to knock ourselves down before I bring us right back up. It's the sandwich compliment, because we'll talk all about, overload, fatigue, recovery, deloads in just one moment. I want to read because people have been leaving reviews, Eric, and I'm just reading the latest one. Sandwich that shit, and we got to give respect because we asked them to do it. And go ahead, like people know this, right? There's 10, 15 minutes of banter, so you could skip right to the main topic, or you could really focus on what's important here, which is this review. Let me read it to you, straight out of Canada. This is the cult you've been looking for. 5 stars, first off. If I'm not hearing Eric and Omar's voices booming through my car speakers every day on my drive to and from work, my whole mood is thrown off. You really feel like you're part of a cult. Oops, I mean family when you get into this podcast. They know. The intro banter sometimes takes up my entire drive to work, which is what we're trying to do here, my friend, to make sure, you get there safely. And I'm not mad about it. Exclamation point. These fellow friendly gym rats are always coming up with excellent content covering all aspects of the iron game, always leaving you with something to think about or with applicable tools to use on the gym floor. As a passionate lifter, I look forward to their new episodes every Monday until eternity. He listens all the way to the end. Just saying, some iron culture merch would be the cherry on top. Oh,
Ooh.
mon frere, stay tuned. That's all we got to say, eh, Eric? Stay tuned.
You just want to say stay tuned, Omar? You want to leave it at that?
It within 2 months, within 2-3 months, it's happening, and I think everyone's gonna love it because I previewed it, Eric, and Eric liked it, and Eric has a discerning spirit. Boom.
All right, I'm good with that.
Yeah.
And let's just say, for those who didn't take part in our little charity sale where we had the Iron Culture shirts, we had Eugen Sandow as one of the kind of legends representing.
Oh, okay.
We've got more ideas on that front. Expand the pantheon a little bit. We've talked about. I'm excited for that, Omar.
Eric, now I gotta say it because what we gave the first, so we don't make money from this. We give money to make this a thing, and we did take all the profit and gave it to charity for the last season. There might be a project that Eric and myself might be working on that maybe could fund that. I mean, sorry, Eric. There's a lot of talk about. My friend, I know we're talking deloads, the nature of fatigue, the purpose of a deload, tapering versus deload. Kick it off for us.
Yes. So without just sitting here hinting you about shirts the whole time, which I know is probably the episode you wanted, hints about shirts, Iron Culture, episode 150 something, whatever it is, 2 hours of us talking about shirt designs. Next time, folks, next time. But today we are going to talk about the topic of deloads. And, deloads are a funny one, Omar, because they're something that are discussed a lot in like the evidence-based space among both powerlifters and bodybuilders. And if you were to if you were to Google Scholar, that's where the real Google really is, folks, or to jump on PubMed and search the term deload, you would, like, and actually in the context of resistance training, peer-reviewed literature, you'd find very little. It is something that everyone agrees needs to be done. Sometimes I've heard the term unload used in more like a general sports conditioning context. But yeah, unloading or light weeks, or just simply, if you look at like a periodization model, the phase after, like the final phase where you're going to go into like general recovery and your training is meant to be purposefully easier to allow recuperation from the more specific phases. Everyone recommends it as a good idea. All sports do it. You won't find anyone who really doesn't in a professional capacity as in the strength conditioning world. And there are, like even in like the super kind of traditional bodybuilding mentality, you take a week off every once in a while, like you go hard, and you take a week off maybe once or twice a year. Like that's something I've talked to from some like really old school traditional dudes who I met, 15 years ago, who've been doing that for ages just to keep themselves fresh or what have you. Also really common for people to take a week off after a meet in powerlifting.
Yep.
That's pretty normal. But yeah, what I think is interesting, Omar, is that it's something that kind of everyone collectively agrees on is, evidence-based, quote unquote, but there's not really a large basis of evidence for it.
Eric, so here's a question for you. When we're even talking about deload, we could talk in the context of training for strength, for hypertrophy, and then what is even the directed aim of said deload? So someone that just competed, I would assume there is the physical component, as well as the mental, though. Like you've been really focusing your entire life for the last 12 weeks to try and hit a PR. And so a much needed almost mental deload of not visiting the gym. My question for you too, even getting into this definition of what a deload is, it seems like there is no consensus, whether it be hypertrophy or strength, how one takes said deload. Like, do you, reduce load or no? So like with a taper, you keep intensity high, but you actually lower volume instead. Oh, for hypertrophy, then what would you do? Well, you lower a little bit of load, but you still have the proximity of failure maybe there. Other people would advocate taking out maybe specific movements or muscle groups. So there's not even a consensus of what a deload, how one should approach a deload, which is also interesting besides, I guess, the lack of literature on it.
Yeah, it's. I think people speak, I think this is something that people get right a lot in the space I'm talking about, despite that lack of an evidence basis, because it is something that needs to be individualized. It needs to be context specific. And it is so heavily based in our understanding of physiology and theory that I think it is like I think we're getting it right more often than not, and it's something that was apparently true through observation and has been since the very beginning of time. Like shout out to you talking about the tetrad system.
Yeah.
In like on our episode where we discussed history, and that is you'll be discussing on the History Channel. Since the earliest recorded instances of training planning, which is not based on peer-reviewed research, it's just based purely on observations and experiences over time, people have realized that they can't just always go hard, or they don't adapt as well, or they don't recover, or they get injured. So having essentially the tetrad system being the earliest form of DUP, this is often baked into periodization models, having a purposeful light day, of some type. So I think ultimately, if we want to unpack deloads, we have to unpack that theoretical underpinning that I was referring to, so we understand why would you even need to do it. So if we go all the way back to understanding how adaptation occurs, that general adaptation syndrome, shout out to Hans, is basically the idea that we encounter a stressor as a biological system, and this we could apply to any plant or animal in existence, life, right? And initially, there is a reaction to that stressor where it puts us slightly out of homeostasis, and we try to deal with it. And then, as long as we are not just exposed to that stressor like a single time, if we're exposed to it multiple times, we get better and better at dealing with it. We adapt to it. So a really good example of applying this to exercise is the first time that you do exercise, your heart rate is going to go up a lot because you're asking your body to output more energy to move in the way that you've been asked, whether you're going on a jog, whether you're doing a hard yoga class, or whether you're squatting 5 reps to a max, whatever. If it's more than you're currently adapted to in terms of energy expenditure and oxygen demand, your heart rate's going to go up to try to deliver that oxygen more efficiently. Okay? And that's a stressor. That's pushing you out of homeostasis. That's not what your resting heart rate is. That's not where your body wants to hang out, or not where it functions most optimally in terms of just pure survival and maintaining a long, healthy life, right? However, the next and next and next time that you expose yourself to that same workout, your heart rate won't necessarily need to go as high. Or you can put out more energy expenditure. You can run faster or farther, or squat more reps or more load, or do harder yoga poses at a faster pace at the same heart rate that you were at when you could do less. So that is the adaptation aspect of it. So general adaptation syndrome is there is the initial alarm reaction, then there's the adaptation phase. However, if you don't give yourself the ability to adapt or the time to adapt, if the dosage is too high or too frequent of that stressor, then you can go into what we would describe in exercise science as an overtraining state, and you actually get quote unquote maladaptation. But if we really just think about it from that kind of general biological systems quality of life, if you were to put a rat on a treadmill and you just kept increasing the speed and kept going, you'd have a heart attack, fall off, die, or get injured, right? So we can't deal with a constant stressor above our current demands without some type of intermittent break. And that's a deload, right? And if we really want to peel it back to like just the basic tenets of how do people train, is most people train with days off. Most people don't train until they can't physically move. They train for an hour or two. They have a feeling that there's a certain requisite amount of work that I need to produce an adaptation, but going beyond that, I'm simply dumping on a whole lot of fatigue with a ever-decreasing amount of benefit from doing it, right? And now we understand in the sporting context that sometimes what we have to do for a sport requires us to go past what would be beneficial from a training perspective. So it's a difference between expressing fitness and developing it. So for example, if you take a CrossFit competitor competing in, say, CrossFit Games, if you look at they have to compete over multiple days doing all of these maximal exertion, trying to get as many reps or as far as they can get, or the heaviest load in a series of lifts, but in the shortest time possible. In each one of those cases, they're putting forth maximal effort. And we see higher rates of injuries in competitions than we do in training. And we're thinking about keeping ourselves like together, like they've got physios on staff, they've got nutritionists there, they have medical people when you go to, say, a triathlon. People are putting forth everything they can. They're pushing themselves way past the point where they would benefit from that exercise and expressing, seeing what are my physical limitations? How far can I possibly take this today? This is what I've trained for. And then what do vol periodization models have after that? A period of recovery, because you've pushed yourself past the point where you can benefit from it. And if you look at the training leading up to one of those events, it's not like people are running marathons multiple times before they run a marathon. There might be something quite similar to that with a certain amount of time before it, before they do what? They taper and recover, right? And I brought up tapering right there, Omar, because probably the most similar line of peer-reviewed research that we can have to extrapolate as to what should a deload therefore look like is from the tapering research. So for those of you who remember our episode with Dr. Hayden Pritchard, who specifically did his PhD here at AUT around the same time I did on tapering practices of powerlifters, and actually did some intervention studies comparing different types of tapers, and looking at all the research on this and the reviews that have been done. And there's also other stuff coming out from other labs and observations of US and Canadian lifters. There was a great study that was just recently published by Kyle Travis out of ETSU, like a huge N of a lot of people reporting what they do in the USAPL and the CPU. We can see that this is a very common practice, and the general principles that seem to hold true both in the observational and the experimental data is that more or less you have a large reduction in volume. We're talking 1 to 2/3 in volume, with either a slight reduction up to a very slight increase in load. And that's pretty much what a taper is. You maintain intensity, drop volume substantially so that you can maintain the specific adaptation, but try to reduce fatigue. So that's the general principle, and that has been repeatedly shown to, in the context of strength, say increase your strength in like that 2 to 5% range acutely from where you were prior to that taper. So when you look at deloads, as say I write about them in muscle and strength pyramids, or when you see them in like evidence-based content, again, you're not going to see this in peer-reviewed literature very frequently at all, if at all, but when you see people posting things about here's how you train, they generally follow those principles, maybe a slightly less aggressive reduction in volume, say like 1/3 to half. And often you're going to see, because we're not trying to peak strength, we're just trying to recover, you'll often see also a reduction in intensity. And in the context of which sport, that could be a reduction in load, or that could be an increase in proximity to failure. So say going from 0 to 2 RIR in that last week of hard training to say 2 to 4 RIR. So that could actually be maintaining load and just decreasing the reps you do, for example, which would also decrease volume. So there's a lot of ways to do it. But the parts that are more or less logically extrapolated are the things that are disconnected from the goals of tapering. The deload goal, unless it comes right before like a testing block, which you could certainly set up a training block to do that. The goal of a deload is not to peak strength. The goal of a deload is to diminish fatigue without losing fitness so that you can then go through another cycle of training. And the reason why someone might need a deload is going to be context dependent. So why couldn't someone just set up a good training split? Well, let's say you train 3 days a week, you got 4 days off, you limit the amount of volume you do on those 3 days. Why would you need a deload? There should be adequate recovery, right? 4 out of 7 days in the week, you're not training. 3 out of 7 days of the week, you are. And it's only a total of 3 to 4 hours. And I think in those cases, unless someone develops, say, like a specific injury, or an overuse thing, because of their individual biomechanics and the exercise they have available, or maybe the technique they use, or whatever, it's very difficult to isolate the occurrence of a single injury to a singular cause. But nonetheless, I think the general fitness enthusiast, personal training client, or someone who's just including fitness as a part of their physical activity regime might not ever need a deload, Omar, because they're not at a point where they're actually trying to push the boundary of what can they recover from. So this is something that is probably most relevant to people who take their fitness very seriously or are in sport where they are trying for that end goal, like I was talking about, of maximal exertion in a competitive environment to see what is the most possible output I can have in my given domain of physical activity, sport, or what have you. And I think when you are doing that, that's when you start to realize that, okay, because I'm trying to adapt as quickly and as optimally as possible and make the highest gains I can get. I'm trying to reach the peak of my personal potential. I'm going to be riding the line of potentially doing too much more often than I'm riding the line of just doing enough to adapt, which would be that first example of someone training 3 days a week or being part of the general public, where you're not actually worrying about fatigue building so much to the point where you are going to need a deload to keep progressing. And I think that is the difference between models of training that do and don't require this, is that if you were to train in a way where you never needed to deload, or some type of mechanism to have light weeks or recovery built it into the periodization model or what have you, or just taking a week off every once in a while, that probably precludes you from getting to the point where you have like top tier level of development or strength. Doesn't mean you can't get quite strong, but I think until you are having to overload to the point where it's actually pushing your recovery capacities, you are probably not going to get there unless the type of training you have eventually requires something of a deload. And that may not occur until you're further into your career as a lifter. Because if you think about it this way, the first time you step in the gym, man, in the first 6 weeks, Omar, I think I went from like being able to do 135 for reps on deadlift to 225 to getting to 300 pounds for reps in probably the first 6 months I trained. Like, the amount of fatigue that I needed to induce to get those adaptations was minimal. I just needed to deadlift, get used to the movement, and build a little bit of muscle mass. And all of a sudden, I have like quite literally doubled my strength. And so that tells you that the dose of training required to get an adaptation early on is so low to get such of a high response that you're heavily unbalanced in terms of the fitness you're getting from training compared to the fatigue it's generating. But that equation changes once you become more of an intermediate. And at that point, if you want to maintain a fast pace of progress rather than kind of eking out just steady progress over time, you will probably get to a place where you might need deloads.
Eric, there is so much to unpack there. First, thank you, as you did on the History Channel episode, sharing your Nordic lineage, which is the clear indicator of your ability just to damn near do, let's be honest, you said 300 pounds. It's like 2.5 times almost increase in such a short time span. This man, he's just built different. There are some branching questions though.
Then I plateaued for 10 years, but nonetheless, yeah.
No, like I said, that's you. You know what they say. Like, there's a powerful line in the Kara manga where it's like you're actually placing that limit on yourself just to remain amongst the mortals. I see you. So a few quick questions. One, when we talk about, so tapering specific aim to peak for strength, got it, right? And then deload to dissipate fatigue. Do you conceptualize it that tapering, it's not under the umbrella of deloads? It's almost like a lateral thing with similar traits, but it is still its own thing? Or is it under the umbrella, but with a different aim?
Yeah, I would almost say it's under the umbrella with a different aim. And the reason being is that they share so much similarities. Like, the goal of a taper is to maximize performance in a athletic context. So that means that you absolutely don't want to detrain, and you don't just want to come away with a net like zero. Like there's nothing wrong from, if you're not competing, with getting back to baseline but having less fatigue, accepting that you're dumping a lot of fatigue but you're also losing a little bit of fitness, so long as each then repeated cycle of that training process, you're on a higher rung of that ladder. You know, it's like, okay, it's like basically saying I'm happy to take 2 steps backward to then take 2 steps forward, because the next block I will take another 2 steps forward starting from that same that place, right? However, and that wasn't a perfect analogy, because I do recognize you take 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. You're never going anywhere. But it would be more like taking 3 steps the next block. But I think from a taper, the goal is right now, or within a week or 2 weeks or however long the taper is, I want to be beyond where I currently am. So if any detraining occurs, it needs to be far less in magnitude to the degree that I am recovering fatigue to express, to show my performance. And I think to understand this concept, this all comes back to what's called the 2-factor model. And this is a model that is useful to explain this dynamic between performance, fitness, and fatigue. But of course, it is just a model. It's not a perfect explanation. And it actually sits on top of the backdrop of like that biopsychosocial model of stress. There's a lot that we experience. So Bannister has actually been talking about this, I think, since the late 80s, at least the early 90s. and it is that two-factor model, the fitness fatigue model. And if you understand it mathematically, it's very simple. When you train, you get fitness and you get fatigue. And fitness is this theoretical max performance that you could have if you had no fatigue, but you never actually see that because you always have a little bit of fatigue from training to some degree. And we're going to talk about, well, what the heck is fatigue? Because it's a very nebulous term in a little bit. And I think that is where sometimes we get into these tropes or maybe too rigid of rules around this, and it comes down to not really understanding what the heck we're talking about. However, if you were to do fitness minus fatigue in a mathematical sense, that would be your performance. That's what you're capable of on any given day. And another aspect of this is that we understand that fatigue dissipates faster than fitness, which we also know to be just true based on logical interpretation of the experienced events that we've had, right? So if we go back to that kind of general adaptation model, if you go on a run right now, your heart rate's going to be elevated. If you go on a run a week from now, your heart rate's going to be elevated. And if you go on a run the next week, your heart rate's going to be elevated. However, your heart rate was not elevated between those periods. It came down after an hour after that run. But each time you run, those 1 week apart, you're carrying almost no fatigue from that run from a week prior, but you're able to run a little bit further if you're a novice just starting out running. Obviously, if you took a trained runner doing that, he'd get slower. 1 time per week is not enough to maintain a high level of performance. But yeah, you take someone right off the couch and they start running once a week. Each time they run, they're going to be a little bit faster or able to maintain the same pace for longer. However, they're not maintaining that same level of fatigue that they had during the previous run or afterwards. So fatigue dissipates quickly and they've maintained some of that adaptation. And that's the basic presupposition of the fitness fatigue model, is that, okay, if we plan training in such a way that we dissipate the most amount of fatigue while maintaining the most amount of fitness, that will result in the highest level of performance. So therefore, what should training planning look like? And almost every extrapolation of periodization has come out is manipulating these concepts, whether that is linear, whether that is undulating, or whether that is block or some combination thereof. So with that said, the original fitness fatigue model wasn't specifically thinking about resistance training. The fatigue that we get from resistance training is a little different than the fatigue that we get from endurance training. If we go back to the correction that I started this whole conversation off with, where we were talking about overtraining and how it's technically never been observed in the peer-reviewed research in resistance training. It has been observed, although it is semi-rare, in endurance athletes. And that's because the volume of training that they accumulate are orders of magnitude higher than that of resistance-trained athletes. And before we experience true overtraining syndrome, months of depressed performance, despite having backed off after a period of high volume, high effort training, that's the definition of overtraining. Before we get to that point in resistance training, we're much more likely to tear a hamstring, get burned out, hate life, and decide we want to be a musician. Terrible idea, by the way, Omar. Those musicians, you can never trust them. Or to have some other factor crop up, have quote unquote mechanical overtraining, something that's not quite an injury, but is below your systemic ability to handle. But man, like your elbow just won't straighten anymore, just as a random example.
Yeah, these are non-specific, but very, very good examples.
Yeah, we're just theoretically out there. There's a musician who can't straighten his elbow fully, who used to lift, and it doesn't resemble anyone we can think of. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that sometimes this theory can fall apart, or it can be applied in maybe too rigid of a manner if you think about fatigue in these nebulous terms. So when someone's talking about, I think I'm fatigued from training, and you go and you interrogate that a little bit more, like, so what do you mean? What fatigue are you talking about? They may not be able to answer that question, or they might start to speak in more kind of tropes, like CNS fatigue, for example. Mm-hmm. That's become a catch-all that you hear among powerlifters or lifters in general when they describe the fact that they're not as strong as they would expect to be right now, but they don't think it's from muscle damage, or they don't think it's from some other factor like a lack of sleep or something else. They don't know what it is, so therefore, what else is contributing to my gains? I've got, am I getting bigger or smaller? Am I currently have damage to my muscles, or do I have these neuromuscular adaptations? Okay, something is wrong with the neuromuscular thing, so it's CNS fatigue, which is, probably functionally incorrect as a definition, and there is such a thing as central fatigue, which we can talk about, but it is describing the fact that we don't know all of the sources of fatigue.
So, Eric, just jumping off of that very quickly, when you talk about the two-factor model, fitness, fatigue, I want to know how they are defining said fatigue, because I would assume that there is a very real, when one is pushing themselves either in the literature or in these studies, where like there is that, I don't know if you want to call it like neuromuscular or whatnot, you're trying to contract as much as possible. You're mentally there, but you have an inability to match the prior performance. So there is a decline. And then I think what the average powerlifter is talking about, however nebulous it is, when they'll either say CNS fatigue or what have you, it's their inability to like squeeze out that extra 2 to 3% because they're always like riding the lightning, so to speak. So maybe they can't have the, the arousal or the excitement, whatever is necessary. So mentally they're not there in arousal. They're mentally not there where they can't commit that extra little juice that they're so used to. So something feels off. And to your point, all the general checks of the biopsychosocial model, like I'm eating enough, I'm sleeping enough, I just don't know what's going on. So quickly, the definition of fatigue in the literature, maybe we could talk about central fatigue if you think it'd be pertinent to this discussion after, but in the literature, when they talk about this two-factor model, what is then fatigue?
Yeah, and there's a lot that goes into this. And I will say the first disclaimer I'll put forth is that, of course, I deal with the concept of fatigue as a sports scientist, but I'm not a fatigue researcher. And I know that there are probably some people who specifically research different elements of fatigue who will feel like I haven't got this completely correct. So I'm going to speak as specifically as I can, but not so specifically as to potentially get some element of fidelity wrong. Okay. So what we experience is the sensations of fatigue, right? And ultimately, that may or may not impact performance. It sometimes will impact certain types of performance. So for example, if you got 4 hours of sleep last night, you're going to feel fatigued the whole day. You're going to feel tired. You're going to feel sluggish. And that will probably have measurable impacts on reaction time, decision-making, and potentially some aspects of endurance, performance, agility, coordination, and decision-making under pressure. However, if I was to test your 1RM, it probably wouldn't actually negatively affect it, especially in a less skilled movement, like say an isometric exercise and trying to see the maximum amount of force you can output. So that's an example of feeling like crap, but not necessarily having it negatively affect you. And that is actually something that I think lifters are very experienced with. Your session RPE could be higher, or your perceived readiness could be lower, but somehow you pull off a PR. And this goes back to that overtraining understanding where it is actually like, dude, that's first study by Fry, where they had them do 8 singles at 95% of 1RM, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. And on average, that group got stronger. They all felt terrible. I guarantee you everyone felt super fatigued. Yeah. But one of the last bastions that your body holds on to in terms of its ability to perform is expressions of one-off force. However, other things can easily and readily be affected. Like we talked about in the carbohydrate episode not too long ago, where if you have like an 8-hour or longer fast and you go into training and we compare having a meal versus not having a meal, it doesn't affect the one-off expression of force, but the total volume you accumulate, especially in a higher volume protocol, will probably be less. So the effects of fasting also can lead to certain types of fatigue. And this is because fatigue comes from multiple different places. So for one, there is peripheral factors. So for example, muscle pH levels, right? So whether you're more acidic or more basic, that's going to affect your ability to keep contracting. And that burning sensation you feel as you get closer to failure, that has a metabolite accumulation process that leads to the inability to keep contracting, right? That is different from, say, trying to lift 10% more than your 1RM. You might be able to lower it down into the hole in that squat, and then you get stuck going up, and you just mechanically cannot produce enough force. There's not enough cross bridges, and those individual fibers can't produce enough force to overcome that external load. You're not failing because of a metabolic byproduct of exertion, right? Also, as you exert more and more activity, as you do more and more reps, you're going to deplete some of your bioenergetic stores, right? So another thing we talked about in that carbohydrate episode is the fact that we store muscle glycogen, and we also store liver glycogen. We talked about how liver glycogen gets depleted primarily from just the availability of food and how long you have been fasted, and that is more respondent to diet. Muscle glycogen is somewhat respondent to diet, but primarily is based on local activity. Our body tries to preserve muscle glycogen levels, and it's stored in different places. It can be stored, within the muscle or outside near the sarcolemma. And when we've in recent times, Hoken and colleagues looked at specific depletion of glycogen in response to different types of training, and they saw that, yeah, you might only deplete overall muscle glycogen 20 to 30% from a standard resistance training session. However, the specific intramuscular stores of glycogen, which are most likely to feel direct contraction immediately in the fast twitch fibers that are producing the most force, was actually heavily depleted following a strength session. So you can get selective muscle glycogen depletion from what you've just done. So a depletion in biogenic stores, the peripheral fatigue from the metabolite accumulation actually as you're doing something. And you can also see fatigue from your hydration status. So as you're doing this, right, as you're exercising, your body temperature is going up because there's metabolic activity of you trying to move, which means that you're then trying to cool yourself off. So how do you do that? Your pores open up, they release sweat, they're evaporated, they cool you off. But now you're losing body water. And dehydration can impact performance, somewhere between 2 to 3%, depending on the performance. Even just the loss of 2% of your body mass can impact endurance performance. A little bit more can impact strength performance. If you get severely dehydrated, you can die. Obviously, the closer you get to death, the worse your performance is. So the active musculature contracting is generating fatigue. Your body responding to that to try to keep you at a homeostatic temperature and maintain an appropriate heart rate and everything going is depleting certain things in your body like fluids and electrolytes. That can lead to fatigue. And the act of contracting is not only generating metabolite accumulation and fatigue, but it's also depleting the stores which fuel it, right? So we use this glycogen to therefore keep recycling ATP. And all of those things contribute in some way to what's known as peripheral fatigue. Now, on top of that, Omar, we're not cars. It's not a metal piston moving through a chamber. It's actually tissue that is contracting repeatedly and undergoing this strain. So we get muscle damage. And muscle damage, while, believe it or not, we're actually still trying to understand it, is a combination of a couple things. For one, we think especially when you're in a lengthened position, there might be actual structural damage to certain aspects of sarcomeres, leading to actual structural damage, but also the process of actually releasing calcium, creating contraction, and the metabolite activity of actually making contractions occur, the byproducts of that also lead to muscle damage. So the metabolic activity. So there's two components. So we typically see more muscle damage in long muscle length and eccentric dominant exercises. That's probably the more mechanical side of it. But even if you do a high enough volume of concentric only activity, you will also get some muscle damage, which means there's probably a bioenergetic component to it as well. Okay. So we got muscle damage. We've got peripheral fatigue, which includes depletion of stores and loss of body fuels and fluids and electrolytes. And then we also have what are called central factors. So if we think of this is probably the closest thing that people are talking about. They're talking about CNS fatigue. Like, I just don't have it today. I can't get aroused, right? I can't stay quite as focused. This can be measured in certain ways. Things that I've never done, but I have, of course, read about. The way you would actually measure central fatigue is you could have someone do a conscious contraction, right? So they're trying to contract something, and you can measure how much force they're outputting. And then you can actually do an electrically evoked contraction on top of that. So you would then put an electric shock through that muscle and see what is the difference between what you can consciously get out and what you max could be able to get out from it locally. And that difference would be a measure of central fatigue. So this means that you can actually have a reduction in actual which muscle groups get recruited. So central inhibition. So central fatigue is the idea that something is going on in the central nervous system that is inhibiting you from actually performing in a way that peripherally it seems you should be able to. Okay, so there are central factors. So if you can't actually get the level of brain neurotransmitters levels to where they should be, that would be an example. Or if cortex excitability is impacted. So nonetheless, there is the concept of what's called the central governor, right? Now, here's where it gets complicated. It would be nice now if we go, okay, we got central fatigue, we got muscle damage, and we got peripheral fatigue. And they're totally separate and independent systems. Absolutely not the way it works. So there is feedback that goes to and from the nervous system, afferent and efferent, if we think back to our biology 101 classes or anatomy and physiology. So, for example, if you are dehydrated, if you are not able to deliver a sufficient amount of oxygen to the working muscle, if your glycogen stores get really low, or if your muscle pH is getting out of the appropriate range, that can then trigger central fatigue. If your muscle damage levels are very high, you will typically measure more central fatigue. So these are all interconnected. And that's why it's so challenging to talk about it. And that's why it's okay in some ways, so long as you are leaning heavily on observations and things that make sense logically, to speak about fatigue in these vague terms. Because fatigue is actually incredibly complex. And you can have one element affecting you and not another. On top of all that, Omar, you can have no fatigue, but have an elbow injury, and that can affect your training, and it can affect your psychology. Pain also goes into all of this. And as we know from our discussions with Nick Leccamelli, Jordan Fagenbaum, Sam Spinelli, and all of, I would say, the most up-to-date modern practitioners in the space of injury recovery, and injury prevention, they will explain to you that pain is a multifactorial concept as well. So we can take all of these physiological concepts that we have and our more or less reductionist approach of explaining them, but all of them sit on the backdrop of that biopsychosocial model.
Eric, you know what makes me truly sad, and I'm being serious for a second? This is a monster episode. I know the cult's going to love it, but some of the exact people that would stand to benefit from listening to this episode are the exact type of people who might not be listening to it, if that makes sense, just very quickly, which does make me sad. I also do take a slight umbrage. Just, I get it. Someone's a lifter. It enters the vernacular. So you say, oh, fatigue. It's, well, you're not actually describing that. Like, it's not the correct nomenclature. Like, I get it. Like, trust me, I get it. But they're trying to describe something that's occurring to them in a language that other people can't understand. Mm-hmm. And if they're not trying to peddle anything, so it's not like, let's say the old kind of meme now, adrenal fatigue. If you're not actively trying to sell things, you're just trying to describe your own individual experience so it's relational and other people can understand it, I'm fine with it being off. But what is interesting, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, when we talk about the general concept of like fatigue, localized fatigue in the muscles and so forth, that powerlifters associate doing a top set when they use that kind of ephemeral term fatigue, like, oh, like a 5x5. But what were we talking about recently where it came to more hypertrophy style training or isolation movements taking closer to failure, that the total amount of not only work done, but then the fatigue localized and then impacted the central governor was higher? Was that something we were talking about maybe like 20 episodes, something ago?
Yeah, so there's, and I want to give a shout out to James Krieger, who has written about this a little bit, and I have as well. The explanatory supposition is that central fatigue is involved when there is some peripheral factors that affect hypertrophy. So let me take a step back. We've got studies showing generally that if you rest too short of a period, you gain less strength or get less big if you compare like two groups over an 8-week period, right? So insufficient rest leads to fatigue fatigue that's not helpful, okay? So if we want to touch more about, like, from a bodybuilding perspective, what kind of fatigue do we care about? And what do we want to avoid and what do we want to leverage? Because obviously, as we're building up closer to a set going to failure, we're reducing RIR. So is fatigue a good thing or a bad thing, right? We know that you can't train at a 10 RIR, 10 reps from failure and get very effective gains. You probably have to be reasonably close to failure, which requires a certain amount of fatigue. But what if you're far from failure for two different reasons? One for central reasons or one from peripheral reasons? Is there a difference and does it matter? It probably does matter, because when you have all of that peripheral fatigue, changes in muscle pH, right? As you're getting closer to failure in, let's say, a high rep set, what's occurring is you're getting fatigue in these slow twitch fibers that don't produce as much force and are active first, because generally you kind of think of it as what's called the size principle. Your body recruits the muscle fibers it needs to produce the force it does. So as you are recruiting these fewer fibers that are not built to produce high levels of power or force, as they fatigue, other fibers then come into play. So if you were to do a set of 20 to failure, by the time you're finishing, say those last 5 to 3 reps or something like that, we don't know the exact cutoff, you are now actually tapping into fibers that would normally only get recruited if you tried to do something explosive or lift very heavy. So you would eventually get there. And it's not necessarily just in this kind of like do. It's supposed that it actually occurs through what's called motor unit cycling. Because when you look at EMG studies, the amplitude of the myoelectrical activity is lower when you do a set of 20 to failure versus a set of 5 to failure the whole time. So what they think is occurring is that to keep it going, you're getting these blips of a high threshold motor unit keeping that process going. So it's not just this continual ramp up, but more of this intermittent inclusion of higher threshold motor units to make sure that you can keep going. But eventually, the endpoint results in the same thing, is that you've trained all the muscle fibers to reach failure, and that's why you can no longer produce force. However, if you did like a 5RM, from the first rep, as soon as you're starting to move that, the load is so high that you have to bring the vast majority of those muscle fibers, including those high threshold motor units, to play to actually produce that force. So interestingly enough, local fatigue is perfectly fine, because it's that local fatigue that eventually gets you to get those high threshold motor units involved, so that you're actually training all of the muscle fibers rather than just the ones that really would be active whether you're, before you even get anywhere near failure. So you're really not getting an effective training stimulus. So local fatigue is absolutely okay. So if that is the case, then why does it matter if you have incomplete rest? Like if I only rest 30 seconds and I come into my next set fatigued, then why am I getting less growth? Because I should be starting right off into more effective quote unquote reps. So this is a head scratching question. And when you look at the research, what we see is that in those training protocols that are 8 weeks long or what have you, comparing two groups, and they don't grow as much from short rest periods, they're primarily doing multi-joint exercises consisting of things like squats, leg press, rows, and presses like bench press. However, when you look at some of the other studies, like an isolated bicep curl study, maybe they use the rest pause technique, or maybe they use drop sets, and you start to see similar or even better hypertrophy in the group that is resting shorter and then doing like a drop or doing a rest pause, or just not resting as long but getting lesser volume but similar hypertrophy. What's going on there? Well, the difference is this efferent afferent feedback that I was talking about. The fact that these are interdependent fatigue systems. If you generate enough peripheral fatigue to the point where it's actually creating kind of this global cardiometabolic fatigue, it can actually trigger central fatigue. And that's far more likely to happen when you're doing something like 5 sets of squats to failure with only 30-second rest periods versus, say, doing 5 drops on a bicep curl, where the total amount of musculature being worked is producing far less total disruption of your body. There's far less energy expenditure required. So I would say not yet proven, but observed, and I would say you could definitely draw some pieces to extrapolate this is probably the case, that when you're doing things that create an overall sense of fatigue, a high metabolic output, generating a lot of cardiovascular fatigue, that is much more likely to trigger central fatigue, which is what you don't want, because now you're not even getting to recruit those muscle fibers in the first place. And that is perhaps why we see that in limited rest period studies, we see poorer hypertrophy, poorer strength gains, because they're getting central fatigue, while in some of these drop set or rest pause studies using a single muscle group or exercise, we're seeing similar or even greater hypertrophy and strength gains, typically just hypertrophy, in the group that is doing that rest period manipulation approach, because they're primarily experiencing local fatigue, and it's just ensuring that each one of those sets, they are training in a state where they're partially locally fatigued, requiring them to then tap into those high threshold motor units quite readily and quickly, even though they're doing less total volume.
Eric, and that's why I brought up the whole concept of training for hypertrophy, let's say, or training certain muscle groups, or a different methodology versus training for strength. Because when we talk about deloads and the concept then of dissipating fatigue, and we're trying to define then fatigue, I suppose then the next question would be, what are some of the considerations that start to go into this concept of a deload if you have different goals? Because if there might be a different either origin or let's say source of said fatigue, how would that then impact how you try and dissipate it?
That's a great question. And I think this is where you need to have some level of flexibility and then take certain concepts that make sense from tapering. So I actually want to throw the question right back at you, Omar, is in your time as a trainer, both training, other powerlifters and writing programs for them through Kaizen or being a personal trainer back in the day, and then also just your own observations as someone who's taken your body pretty damn far. I basically consider you like a non-competitive competitor in terms of the need for deloads.
Sure.
Just because you haven't gotten on a platform, you have squatted 500, deadlifted 600, benched over 350, all at a body weight under 200 pounds. So like, I know that you train in such a way that you do have to consider these things.
Yeah.
So what is your perspective on that? I'm curious, what have you landed on just from kind of following the general trends, seeing what makes sense, and then your own observations of yourself?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about it for a deload, it's actually pretty complex, meaning that one, for the individual, you have to have the consideration of, okay, well, how long have you been training? What have you been doing for that block? Have you been carrying over fatigue? So let's say I'll give you an example, like just very small, not a talk just about me right here, but I'll use myself as an example, and then maybe how I try and generally apply it when programming for people. But let's say when I was on that block, when I was really focusing on trying to get stronger. So I was on a squat intensive block, and it was something where the vast majority of my leg volume was actually comprised of, let's say compound movements. So I was just squatting and doing squat variations. And so it was a very high level of intensity. And so I would use that kind of nebulous, like I was accumulating fatigue, which was more kind of that like central fatigue where, as we alluded to with those people doing 8 singles at 95%, you don't feel great after that. And so the deload that I would do, or how I would try and dissipate the fatigue, would be vastly different than if I was in a hypertrophy oriented block. And exactly what I mean when I say that is that I would keep still the specific skill of trying to do singles, but it would be like at an RP 7. So let's say, okay, I'll just an example, because it'd be I'm leading up. I have a 16-week kind of like 2 different blocks, 2 8-week blocks, leading up to hopefully a 16-week PR. What I would do is that I would then, after every 4 weeks or 4 to 6 weeks, I would then have a week where it'd still be intensive. So I'm still squatting basically, let's say for some singles, 87% and above, but it'd be like at 7, right? As opposed to for that week, it'd be a few singles at 8, maybe 8.5, and then some back down sets. So I would keep the skill acquisition part there. I would drop a little bit of the volume. So it'd be a slight reduction in volume. And then it would be a slight reduction in intensity, but still keeping that practice very much there. So the central thing was there. Whereas if I was in a more hypertrophy-oriented goal, let's say a set, so I'm doing kind of like maybe, I guess, a little bit more block periodization where I'm trying to get after those gains, I would focus much more personally if I was doing training a muscle group and I was doing approximately 20 sets per week. I would decrease that by like 30%. More like every 6 to 8 weeks, just to give myself a bit of a break where it's like, okay, like, you know what, yeah, like I was doing this, my elbow's feeling a little wonky, this is happening, I want just a breath of fresh air when I come back, and I feel not only mentally prepared, but my body itself, because I'm kind of trying to accumulate more total, load and volume week to week to week to week. So it'd be less about dissipating some of that, I'll call it like, central or in my mind mental fatigue, and much more about actually my body, my joints, and everything else feeling better. So that's for myself personally. And then I'd say when it comes to Kaizen or when it comes to programming for people, it depends upon what they're doing. And so if it's kind of an amalgam, if it's like, hey, we're doing like a power building or whatnot, it is probably still keeping the fundamental movements there, keeping a little bit of practice. It might still only be at like 80%. And then also, so a double pronged approach of keeping the skill acquisition there, so practice in singles, but then also decreasing more volume. If it's power building, if it's more strength oriented, then it'd be less of a volume decrease, and then more just keeping that intensity. If it's more for strength, it would be taking that volume way down and then keeping the intensity still there. And then if it's for hypertrophy, then it would be actually lowering both intensity. So proximity failure depends upon the person, or maybe a reduction in load, proximity failure then a little bit higher. So then those are like the 3 kind of buckets for people, I'd say, in my experience.
And the reason why I wanted to ask you is because I had a feeling you were going to be able to answer this question just as well as I would. And I think those are fantastic because this is something, again, it's just such an intrinsic experience of anyone who has pushed themselves close to their limits, as they realize that something gives. Like you said, it could be, I just can't get it up. No pun intended. From an arousal perspective, like the level of focus and intensity and the amount of fear quelling that I need to do to lift heavy on a regular basis is something that I just can't get it together today, and it would maybe even be unsafe for me to try to do so. I'm mentally burned out. I'm really, really tired of this. I have an elbow tweak, a knee tweak. My lower back is sore. Or yeah, I am just feeling sluggish. I'm really, really sore. Like all of these things are different sensations associated with potentially different buckets that we talked about fatigue. And the decision of what variable in your resistance training that you would therefore quote unquote deload should change. And I think we still have this tendency to discount the mental aspect, but it is real. Like it is a big deal. And I think people just don't understand how much of an impact it has. So I'm going to throw some more research at you, then I'm going to get more to practical applications just to kind of give people to really acknowledge this. So the first one I want to talk about is by Bartholomew, 2008. Or what they did was they had a bunch of people who were training and they tracked their strength gains. And then they asked them to report the number of perceived negative life events they had. And they found that those who perceived more negative life events, this could be literally anything, and it has to do a lot with perception. This is that biopsychosocial model, made slower strength gains, right? So the things that are outside of the gym, outside of all of the things that I said, affected fatigue, impact your training outcome. So that two-factor model, again, in the background is that biopsychosocial model. And that's kind of like the long term. Like if we look at this, multi-month period of how many stresses did you have in your life and did you perceive them as negative as positive, that's going to impact your gains, right? Even more acutely, there's a wild study that was done by Cook and Cruther that was published, I think, in 2011 or 2012, that was titled Changes in Salivary Testosterone Concentrations in Subsequent Voluntary Squat Performance Following the Presentation of Short Video Clips. Okay? So what they did was they took these highly trained male athletes, 12 of them, and they checked on their saliva concentrations of free testosterone, and then they had them do 3 rep maxes on squats. But before that, they had them watch these like short clips, okay? So they had them either watch a brief video clip of a sad, something like a sad clip, an erotic clip, so something a little perhaps pornographic, an aggressive clip, so kind of emphasizing anger, like a training motivational clip, like, Rocky or something like that, or a humorous clip, or just kind of a neutral clip of something that didn't try to evoke any emotions. And they found that not only was performance negatively impacted by the sad clips, the performance was improved when they watched either the aggressive, I want to say it was, double check this. Yes, 3RM performance was noted improved after the erotic, aggressive, and training motivational clips. So we're not saying here at Iron Culture that you need to go watch porn before you lift, but it wouldn't hurt you, is all I'm going to say based on this study.
We have, there's the Iron Culture reading list, and there's the Iron Culture like porn go-to playlist pre-training.
Right, exactly. You could also watch, is probably no one is surprised, training motivational clips or some types of aggressive clip, So I think that's interesting. And it also mapped on the individual level between changes in testosterone and 3RM squats. So there are physiological changes that occurred from the acute watching just minutes prior to performance of a certain video, and that had a knock-on effect on performance. So I think that's really interesting, meaning that if you just got off the phone and you had just an awful argument or a confrontation, and then you went right to the gym, that might negatively or positively affect your performance, depending on if you felt aggressive or erotic in that conversation. I don't know. So I think there's something to be said for cultivating the right mental state, because let's say that you repeatedly train after work, and the last thing that occurs at work is almost always something sad or just it's a negative experience for you. That will probably chronically have a negative impact on your training, decrease the level of gains you're getting, and potentially make you feel more fatigued in general. That might affect your deload frequency, right? And if that is on top of or in place of or some combination with a general trend of phase of your life where negative things are happening or positive things are happening, that's going to all be interacting with everything we talked about. So this is why the deload frequency might change during contest prep. Or, independent of nutritional manipulation, it might change when you have a child, or you change work, or you're going through a divorce, or anything that would affect your mentality as a lifter. So I think that needs to be said first. So that's why it should be flexible, because it needs to be individually tailored to your context, situation, and life. With all that said, I think we take the pieces that make sense from tapers, because tapers are effective at dissipating fatigue, but they're also targeted at enhancing performance. So again, I would not use kind of our standard taper model unless you were going deload, end of the deload week, test strength, which I think is a great way to set up training. I do that a lot in my muscle and strength pyramids. But you don't have to do that by any means. If you had kind of like that top single approach with a relatively high RPE, you can kind of always have an idea of where your strength is. And it might trend up at the end of a block where you're planning for it to trend up, but you don't actually need to go through a testing phase. So therefore, you need to think about, well, all right, what aspect of fatigue is affecting me the most? Am I mentally burned out? Am I just not able to get it up and go? Am I dreading my training because it's so hard? What element of hard is challenging for me right now? Or do I feel beat up, but I'm still very motivated to train, and I'm actually not looking forward to this deload because I don't want to do the standard 3x5 at 70%, which feels like, why am I even in here, right? Do I have an ache and pain or an injury? So I think those are all considerations. I think probably the default setting that I think applies both across the board to people whose goal is strength or hypertrophy is some reduction in volume. That should pretty much always be there if you actually need the deload, right? However, the question of what do I do with intensity is typically the one that I think filters into different buckets like you were talking about, Omar. If you were just in a phase of trying to peak strength and you were grinding shit out and going very, very hard, think of it this way. You just did a taper for your last competition of the year as a powerlifter. You just did Worlds. And what are you going to do next week? Well, you just had a taper and you just lifted heavy. You're a powerlifter, so intensity is important. I guess I should maintain intensity and drop volume. No, that's crazy. Like you just squatted probably and benched and deadlifted the heaviest loads or close to it that you did the whole year and paid some price for it typically. So it doesn't make any sense to maintain high loads. And also, since your competition season is over and you just went through a pretty significant taper, your volume might come up relative to what you're doing because you just came off of a taper. So if you were to compare the last 2 weeks of training before Worlds to the 1 or 2 weeks afterwards, you're probably going to see a decrease in intensity and an increase in volume. However, you'd probably be far from failure. You'd be doing non-specific movements. So that would be a very context-specific, like end of powerlifting year or competitive year, deload. It would be very different than what we would do for, say, a bodybuilder. So a bodybuilder, for example, what were you just doing in that block? Were you doing mostly sets of 10 to 20 at a high RPE on single joint movements? You're probably not feeling much in the way of aches and pains. You might have a fair amount of muscle damage, but you could probably lift heavy right now if you wanted. So maybe you're gonna, not change intensity. Maybe the thing that's fatiguing you is getting it together to keep going to the point where you're starting to really feel like you're gonna yak, or just overcome that burning sensation in your quads that you have started to get a little tired of after 4 weeks. So your deload might be that, there's a reduction in volume, but you actually increase load substantially. You train in the 2 sets of 8 to 10 versus the 3 sets of 15 to 20 that you were doing, for example. So I often try to look at, what is the source of perceived fatigue? What variable for this person right now is what's really burning them out? So for example, right now I'm in a extended bodybuilding off-season phase. And I'm going through phases where I do higher reps or lower reps, or I emphasize more training at longer muscle lengths. It tends to produce a little more muscle damage. Or I am, trying to increase sets, or I'm trying to increase load. I'm leveraging different variables in a cyclical fashion in my training. So what I will often deload is the thing that I am most burnt out on. So for example, I need to decrease volume, but I'm still motivated to train, but I really don't want to do X. So I will decrease my training frequency from 5 days to 3 days and remove X, but keep everything else in. So the most recent example, I was doing a lot of high rep training. I was doing some BFR, and I was really kind of pushing myself. So I didn't want to do heavy squats. So I was doing lunges instead. I was doing BFR leg extension, BFR curls, BFR calf raises, BFR stuff in my arms, just really high rep stuff, and pushing myself past that point of discomfort with local pain sensations. I was getting tired of that. So my deload, I actually increased to like the 6 to 8 RM range, didn't do any BFR, focused on compound movements, and just did like 2 to 3 sets and just 2 to 3 exercises, but just actually went really close to failure. So if you're looking at my logbook, you'd be like, this is a deload. You did like 3 8 RMs on like a row and a bench press this day. Like, how's that a deload? Well, like what did I do last week? I actually trained on 2 other days, and I did an additional exercise for each muscle group with another 3 sets. So I think it really should be tailored to the individual. And I think a stock standard reduction in volume, relative maintenance of intensity, perhaps a reduction in proximity to failure, or increase in proximity to failure, I should say, being further from failure, is a decent starting point. But ultimately, it should be tailored to what is the variable that is resulting in those perceptions of fatigue that is impacting performance that you need a deload from.
Eric, this is a powerhouse episode. You've done it once again. I think something that is very, it's worth repeating for us here, just when we talk about deloads, we talk about individuals and what their training styles are, and whether it's, strength or hypertrophy. One of the things that you said in a previous episode I really liked was that effort's kind of a given at a certain level, meaning that some people kind of that miraculous, oh, your body's really adaptive, you could push past it. It's like, there's a certain theoretical, and that's why I like the distinction you even said at the beginning. And I would posit, I'd put forth, like, for the Iron Cult, they're kind of about this life. So again, if you're not training at a certain threshold, if you're more recreational, these aren't as high of considerations for you. But if you are about this life, and we talk about like the mental component, like showing up when people are indicating certain things, like we joke about the arousal or not being there, or even like the central governor, like their inability, there's something that they're trying to quantify and talk about. And it's at once useful, but then also not useful, depending upon the context, where it's either like train through it. Like, so here are some of the like general truthisms that you'll hear, like I would say platitudes, where it's like, your body doesn't tell you the truth, or your body lies to you. Like, you can't trust your body. Like, true. Like, as you just said, like, where force is one of the last things to go. So you could be sleep deprived, feeling like shit, still hit a PR, no problem. But at the same idea, it's like, but wait a second, like, are you actually feeling mentally fatigued? Like, is this a real thing, or are you just not stepping up to the plate, right? It's kind of like this weird juxtaposition that some people try and frame it. And I think if we don't recognize the fact, and this is one of the minor epiphanies I've had over the last several years, is that we are humans participating in the rest of our lives besides just lifting. I do notice a trend. Let's say it doesn't matter, like USAPL, I pay more attention to those interests in strength, so like powerlifters, but I'm sure it would apply also for bodybuilding, that those in the USAPL or the IPF there at the top level, not at all that their lives are easier. That's not what I'm trying to imply, but they've organized their life as such that they could put a considerable amount of time and mental energy towards the thing that they love. So in all possible worlds of what they're trying to pursue, and I could think of a few very acute examples of this, where one person specifically chose a job, they get relatively the same pay. Maybe this person might be a little bit more passionate about another career, but they chose a career that was easy enough for them to do, got good compensation, but it wasn't stressful, so that it wouldn't impact other areas of their life, chiefly their training. And this is someone that was like a world champion. And this is just one small example. And I can't help but think that for the average person, like, let's say like Eric, during your phase, this is a perfect example. Like, man, my man's getting a PhD. Is he about to complicate his life? And the question must be asked, like, okay, like, you're getting your PhD, you're doing all this work, like, you could compete. Conceive, like, you could compete in bodybuilding if Eric like really wanted to do the gauntlet, go through the crucible, and just like add an extra layer of challenge. You could have been about that life. Would it have, provided any meaningful improvement or anything like that? No, there's a time and place for everything. And so I think that nuanced conversation, it's not just the question is like, is a deload even useful? Do you even like deserve a deload? It's like, well, within the context of what's going on in my life and everything else, it would have a high utility for me. And to me, that gets slightly lost sometimes in the conversation when we talk about how adaptive we are as people, and that the mental strength one must cultivate. With us, I think like in the Iron Culture, like me seeing you train, like that's a given. Like, I never think like, oh, like is Eric not putting in the work? Like, hey, buddy, like, do you really need this deload? Like, that's not a consideration at a certain point in one's lifting career. Not to say that it's never a consideration. In fact, it often is. But at a certain point, it actually isn't really relevant to the total conversation.
No, you're 100% right. And I think the way this comes into it functionally, you were talking about, you can push past it, or, the fatigue you're feeling is a lie, like your body's lying to you. You could hit a PR, or and where that connects to people organizing their life is that ultimately this is everything is physics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed; it can only be converted. So if you're feeling the sensations of fatigue, it's gonna you're paying for that somewhere. There's no free lunch, right? It doesn't just disappear. You can talk yourself down from the ledge, manage it internally, and go through that process of then convincing yourself and forcing yourself to get the arousal up and hit that PR, right? So that's an upfront payment. And then there might be consequences to that. You might feel even more fatigued afterwards. That might affect your next training, or maybe it doesn't, and you're able to compartmentalize, but you're more of an ass that day, or you're less focused on work, or you are, not driving as well just because you're frazzled, right? Maybe you get a ticket for running a stoplight, or something like that. I mean, there are going to be consequences. So there are many ways to manage that. If you're going to be pushing past that point of perceived fatigue, there could be a higher risk of injury. Maybe not. It could just be as simple as the fact that you are more stressed and it affects your sleep, which has knock-on effects on something else. It's like, a whole floor full of marbles, and you drop a new marble in there. They're all going to move, or a number of them are going to move to some degree. There's going to be these ripples out that we can't predict. So you can pay for it up front. Like you said, the specific lifter who, organized their life and their career to make more space for lifting, that's 100% valid. You can also take someone else who doesn't do that, but then stubbornly tries to keep training at that same level, and it affects their ability to be a father or a mother or a husband or a wife, a partner, more generally, or they're not as effective at their job, or something. Something always gives. If there was an action, there's going to be a reaction, right? There's no way around it. The question is where do you want it to be? And I think that's what we need to acknowledge. That if I decide to push through it and go today, and I think that the deload is not warranted, okay, then I need to accept the potential consequences of that. But what you don't want to do is to push through it because of some moral belief about deloads being weak, or me being a weak person if I deload, or to think that, the body's signals are just signs of weakness rather than signals, and that I need to overcome them. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger type of thing. So I think an intelligent athlete, and the difference between, an intermediate and an advanced athlete, is that you recognize the signals and you have enough self-awareness, and you're not clouded by fear or these moralistic determinants, or you're not striving hard just to be accepted by yourself and your peers and to have the identity you want as a lifter, but more so you're singularly focused on, is now the right time for me to push? Is this the point where I incur a little bit of debt and I have to pay this off on the back end? Or would it make more sense to deload or take a day off or not do this top set or what have you because of what I'm experiencing now? What is the signal telling me? What's the best course of action afterwards? And what am I willing to accept for how I'm going to have to pay this debt? Because you will have to pay it. So on that front, I think it is just really important to have that self-awareness, and that's why a lot of people hire a coach, because they can have another objective eye to give them that feedback. And I also think it's really important to have that flexibility and understand there's different ways to deload. For example, Menno Henselmans talks about just deloading the specific exercises where you are, not progressing or you're regressing. And, he kind of takes the more reductionist mindset of, generally for bodybuilding purposes, you're going to see specific muscle groups get sorer than others, have more muscle damage, not progress, or maybe you're doing too little or too much volume on them. So you kind of approach it on a muscle by muscle basis. And I think there are some contexts where that is valid. That's definitely a tool to keep in the tool belt. I wouldn't take that off the table. But there are many contexts where you're also doing a lot of exercises that have more systemic effects. I'm not going to call a squat a quad exercise just because bodybuilders think of it as that way. I'm not going to call a deadlift a hamstring exercise just because they think of it that way. And I'm not going to call a chest and back day only affecting your chest and back, when you're doing pressing and pulling for, 8 to 12 sets a piece. I think we have to acknowledge that even though we might program in a reductionist body part specific way, they do often have systemic effects, especially when training closer to failure with higher volumes, including a lot of compound movements. So we also need to have on our tool belt and on the table the opportunity to just deload the whole system, because like we said, everything has interdependent effects. You get peripheral fatigue, it can result in central fatigue. You get muscle damage, it can result in central fatigue. And we can't exactly extract all these pieces, and the sum is truly greater than the parts.
Eric, let me tell you something right here. This is why this is a monster episode. I'll say you, just did some jazz, basically, where if we use Coltrane's Giant Steps, we're taking someone on a journey. It's like a movie, right? Where they might not know where it's going to end up. And I think some people, they want that twist. So they want that M. Night Shyamalan. That's what they're focusing on. Like, oh my, wait, what? It was his daughter all along? He was dead? What's going on? You're just spoiling each film or just stop.
But he's wearing red.
Yeah. Oh, it was red. Yeah. No, we actually just we revealed the end of 8 of his films at once. But it gives the context and understanding. I genuinely, from participating in this, also listening in this episode, I like the flow where it all leads up to something that, we could have summarized deloads, when to do it, in 2 to 3 minutes. But now I think people understand within the greater context of their training. And that's why at the very end, that's why I use the example of the song Giant Steps. It just sounds like a flurry of notes. But when he wraps it up basically at the end, it all makes sense, everything that came before it. And I think that's what I appreciate. I just want to say very quickly, as a little bit of gratitude to the cult, for us doing the podcast, being allowed, having the space, and people actually enjoying it, is that you can go on these lengthier journeys as opposed to you know what I mean, Eric, the YouTube style where you got to give them up front. In fact, to kind of entice them, you almost give a tease and then you'll quickly, within sub 5 minutes, you got to deliver on that. Otherwise they'll click out. And
what's the shortest way I can tell you why, and then immediately what?
Yeah. And that basically presents itself with a decent superficial understanding where you can have you can reduce it down and you could get it right, so you have the right answer, but you might not understand the fundamentals, and then you can listen to an episode like this, you're there are a lot of considerations, and the next time I think about these things, the rigidity that I thought about before, okay, maybe this make more sense for me. You have the proverbial more tools in your tool set now, I think, to work with. So no, very well done.
Thank you, sir. And well said. I think I really liked when I just asked you, how do you do it? Because you considered everything I talked about without necessarily having to go, where is the peripheral, central, or metabolic or muscle damage related factors affecting me, So, I think it's important to get a glimpse of understanding all of that, because there are enough tropes out there in the fitness space that create rigid rules based upon false assumptions or over extrapolations that we kind of have to get into the nitty gritty so that you understand that those tropes are false, and they can lead you down rigid pathways that would be, less optimal at best, or potentially, a barrier to your success. So what does this result in for most people is that somewhere in the range of every 4th to 12th week, they take it easy. And I think you want to do it in a way that still maintains motivation. One of the reasons why lately I've been going from, instead of, I think historically the way I would have deloaded, I'd train 5 days a week. I keep training 5 days a week, but just have 5 really easy sessions, is that I don't enjoy those sessions, And when I enjoy a session, I bring a level of focus. Not I got to go watch a training. I got to go watch the Rocky speech, and then I got to get myself hyped up, make my wife slap me in the face, and I can hit a heavy load or go to failure. But more so, I really enjoy the training process, and why can't I enjoy a deload? So how can I enjoy a deload? And then I bring, an effortless level of intensity to it, which is what my goal is. So what I do now is I get that reduction in volume through reducing my frequency to 3 days per week. So it's an automatic, at least 40% reduction, even if I train exactly the same way on those 3 days. But I get even more than that, because I typically I'm doing maybe 2/3 to half of the volume on those 3 days. So we're looking in total a pretty large reduction in volume, because I take it to the house during my deloads unless I've got, joint related stuff. I like to go close to failure. I like to train just as hard on my deloads, but with fewer exercises on fewer days. And that's a way that I never actually find that I have a lull in my training that's demotivating. Then it's kind of hard to get that momentum started again for me.
Oh, yeah.
So that's something that's a little tip and trick of the trade that I've learned after 17 years. One thing I've observed as a coach, I don't know if you've ever notice this, Omar, but when you use that traditional deload, like, okay, I'm going to still train just as much, but I'm going to do half the sets and I'm going to drop the load by 15%. So if I just did 5x5 at 80%, I'm going to do, 3x5 at 70%. And it's just like, why do I even need to be here? You were surprised by the fact that 3x5 at 70% feels heavy.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why is just the same reason that Cook and Cruther saw, like going to the gym and watching different movies, like a sad movie produces poor performance. You don't get yourself hyped up to go do 3x5 at 70%. You expect it to feel like a warm-up. You bring less than a warm-up level of intensity, and it feels heavy. And then the funny thing is, I remember back when I was a younger coach, I used to feel like a genius. I was like, see, you came in the deload, and light weights felt hard. You must have needed that deload. Yeah. I have the crystal ball. But I think in reality what it was is I was setting them up for that by giving them easy training, which they were not looking forward to. And they were, basically about as aroused as they were if they're going to go, read Wikipedia for when they're getting under the bar. But I don't experience that now that I do deloads the way I was describing, where I'm still actually lifting hard, just with less total volume on fewer days.
I'm 100% guilty of thinking the exact same thing. Like, man, you must have been so fatigued that clearly your performance isn't there. Yeah, it's like reading Wikipedia, but it's reading Wikipedia when they're asking for donations and you can't even read the article. So you have to read like, if everyone just reading this right now donated $2, like it's reading that part of it. It's like the worst part. Now, Eric, final thing, man, because you talk and I agree wholeheartedly. Like you're essentially acclimating to the temperature in the room. So like, you got to train. Like it's a big session. You mentally prepare for it. I think that's just a hallmark of any good lifter, where you're running kind of through those sessions, as we said, like painting that mental picture. Weirdly enough, when I said 2022 year making gains, there may or may not be someone with an elbow thing that's finally getting over who is trying to do the musician thing. That wait a second, was that Equelius there? Maybe he can or can't relate. When I said, hey man, maybe like me, I'll come down to New Zealand. And I said, this is the only part that I don't understand, because everything that you've talked about this episode makes complete sense. But then I did say, hey, like, how's like July for me to come down? And you said, oh, July, what date? And I said, whatever, like, I'm flexible from the 5th to like the 21st or whatever. You said, weird, I got an extended deload. I wouldn't even be training. It wouldn't be worth it. Cool. Okay. So I was like, not a problem. Then I said, like, how's September? And you said, wait, let me check that. Yeah, it's a really weird training year for me. I'm also deloading. That's not a good date. So I'm just assuming that you're experimenting with a new methodology that you'll be talking to the cult about later. That was the only part I was a little confused about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the don't train with Omar methodology.
Oh, okay.
And we're seeing how it goes. Yeah.
Because it's automatically a sad session and therefore performance. You're saving yourself.
Yeah. Or maybe it's that I'm too worried that training with you is going to be like an erotic experience every time, and like the time period that you're here, the training is going to just be so charged with sexual energy that I'm never going to have good training again afterwards. So
look, there's two ways of interpreting what you meant by don't come, and that's the one that I'm going to take with me. So Eric, question for you: is there anything you want to say to wrap it up? Because I do think this is it's on the upper pantheon.
Oh, no, well, thank you for that. I'm glad to hear it. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I have nothing else to add.
Okay, so I'll add something. I'll say what's amazing to me is that you proposed 2 very strong episodes for us to cover behind the scenes. And I didn't think this one was not as strong, but I think the other one coming up is still an extremely strong subject to cover that will unearth new territory for the cult. But this one, it went there. So we're spinning fire in 2022. If everyone's listening still right now, you could go ahead. I want to see 100 comments related to the cult and specifically Eric, because I want them to read it. I want them to see it. I want them to believe it. I want them to feel the fire and the fury that's happening in 2022. But thank you everyone for listening, watching another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. We are, it's 92, but it's number 1 in your hearts, and it's number 1 in actual fitness. So here we go. Especially because Eric, I know we joke about things and we get like jokingly politically charged with like some statements, but like also some other podcasts, not any of our colleagues, like shout out to Stronger by Science, but just like where they're doing like pivots. Like I've actually listened to a few episodes. So like we are we are a training, exercise, nutrition podcast like that. Yeah, there's 10 minutes of banter, but like some people are trying to extend in that way. We're what you need. We're the fundamentals right here. So go ahead, leave a rating and review. We're back every single Monday. We'll see you from now until the end of time.